Hey everyone, we're happy you could join us for today's session, How to Ace Your Next Job Interview with guest speaker Angie Jones. This is the point where I usually intro the speaker, but today I decided to quote automation and Selenium guru Dave Hafner, who wrote this about Angie and this webinar earlier this week. And I'm quoting him because in my opinion, he absolutely nailed it. So here goes. To say Angie knows her stuff is putting it mildly. Angie is a senior automation engineer at Twitter. She has developed automation strategies and frameworks for countless software products and has been making the rounds with public speaking engagements at various dev and test automation conferences. Angie will be focusing on a topic that everyone in test automation would benefit from paying attention to, especially when presented by someone as stellar as Angie. And that's technical interview questions for automation engineers. You're likely to learn loads of practical and immediately useful tactics from her for both your automation and hiring practices. It's definitely worth a watch. So without further ado, Angie, the stage is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in today. We're going to talk about technical interviews. I titled this The Ultimate Test, Ace Your Next Technical Job Interview. And while there's definitely information for like developers, this session is specifically targeted toward automation engineers because I believe that our interview experience is unique. So last fall, I ran across TJ Meyer. He's a tester turned self-taught automation engineer who's been writing and speaking about the new interview process for automation engineers. And he warned us last year that the interviews for us were becoming very developer-centric. So I interview plenty of automation people all the time, and what I covered was nothing like what TJ experienced. So I thought maybe it was just a regional thing, maybe it was just his area, until a couple of months ago, I went on a job hunt myself and interviewed with several companies in different areas across the country, and all of them had interviews that resembled what TJ spoke of. So he was right. The game has definitely changed. Now, I'm thinking the automation engineer interview might be the most difficult one because not only do they ask us automation questions, but they're also asking us testing questions and developer questions. So each one of those may have its own round of interviews. So I want to go through each of these types of questions and help you learn how to think through them. For the developer questions, I'll do some step-by-step problems that closely resemble ones that I was given during my interview process. So let's start with the testing round. The automation role is thought to be a hybrid role between tester and developer, meaning the person has a tester's mindset but with a developer's skill set. So I interviewed quite a few automation engineers who honestly really weren't that good at testing. Many companies have gotten burned by allowing their developers to lead the automation efforts. So they've now realized how important it is to have a coder who actually thinks as a tester does. So they typically won't drill you too long on this testing round, but they'll ask just enough to make sure that you know what you're doing. So a common approach to interviewing a testing candidate is to ask them, how would they test a physical object? So this may be an easy one for experienced testers, but there's a lot of people who are automation engineers who have not necessarily served as an actual tester. So they're accustomed to testers doing all of the work to understand the requirements and the design and then coming up with the scenarios and basically handing off these test cases for them to code up. But nowadays roles are blending a lot more, and it's really important to have an automation engineer who also understands how to test. So given this question, how would you test a chair? when I ask questions like this, typically the first thing people do is jump into how they would test it based on their assumptions. If I were to ask this question in an interview, people just start spitting out scenarios like, oh, I would make sure I could sit in it. I would make sure I can adjust it to be higher, make sure I can adjust it to be lower. I would make sure I could swivel in it. This is not how a tester thinks. Testers are inquisitive. Testers make sure they understand how the system should work and what the intended customer use cases are. Only then can they test to ensure the product is working as desired. So for your interviews, before you jump into how you would test the object, ask questions to make sure you understand the problem. So maybe ask what kind of chair it is. All of the scenarios that you spouted off without asking any questions won't necessarily work if the interviewer has a different chair in mind. Ask them what are the requirements of the chair. Ask them who are we building the chair for and how do we anticipate them using it. Imagine if I was the interviewer and I said that the chair was not going to be used for sitting. It would be used for standing on to reach high items. The scenarios would be much different then. So just make sure that you're asking questions. The automation round. A common mistake I see people make is to only prepare for UI questions when going for an automation interview. And so when I start asking about anything outside of that, candidates are stumped. So here's the famous automation pyramid introduced by Mike Cohen. If you're not familiar with this, be sure to learn as much as you can about it. I have a link right there at the bottom, and I also have a resources slide at the end of this deck, which I will share with you all. You want to learn as much about it, not just for the interview, but to better yourself as an automation engineer. So here's a brief overview. The size of the layers here represent the quantity of automated tests you should have at each layer. The base of the pyramid is the largest area, and it indicates that the bulk of your automated test should be at the unit test layer. The next largest layer is the services layer, and this indicates that you should also automate a substantial portion of your tests using web services and business logic. And then finally, the smallest layer is the UI layer, meaning the smallest subset of your automation should be done directly against the interface. Yet, most people only prepare to discuss the UI testing in the interview. So let's look at the type of questions you might be asked about the other layers of the automation. So the question is, given this method's signature, how would you test it? And you may be thinking, oh crap, I don't ever do unit tests. I don't know. What you want to do is fall back on your tester's mindset. So just because it's not a graphical user interface doesn't mean you don't know how to test it. Take a second to understand the inputs and the outputs. We see here that this method takes two integers and it returns an integer. Also, given the name of the method, we assume that it'll add the numbers and return the sum. But it doesn't hurt to ask a clarifying question, such as, I assume this method adds the two parameters and returns the sum, right? Just to make sure it's not a trick question. In fact, if there's anything that's not perfectly clear or obvious to you, ask about it. If you find yourself becoming self-conscious and you think you're asking too many dumb questions, then just remind the interviewer and yourself that you're a tester and you're trained to challenge assumptions. They'll appreciate that. Okay, so for this one, I recommend listing every test you can come up with. We don't see the body of this method, so don't assume what's inside of it. Don't assume everything is going to work beautifully. Don't assume that it was implemented the way that you would implement it. So here's some tests that I would list. Maybe I would call this with two positive integers. Call it with two negative integers. Call with a positive A and a negative B. Call with a negative A and a positive B. Call it with A being 0. Call with B being 0. Call with both A and B being 0. Call where the sum of A and B exceeds the memory capacity of integer. Right? So many of you are much better testers than I am, so I'm sure you can probably think of more. The more the merrier, even if it doesn't seem the test will cover new ground. People want to know that you can come up with lots of scenarios. On a job, it's much easier to get you to decrease your scope than to try to teach you to think broader. And then if you do happen to get any pushback about going overboard with the scenarios in your interview, just remind them that you don't want to make any assumptions, and you can also throw in a disclaimer that you're rattling these off the top of your head and could probably narrow it down some if needed. Now, you do need to be a bit careful with this. While this is gauging your testing abilities, it's also testing how much you understand about code. So the very first thing was understanding the signature of this method. Don't list tests that violate this and would be impossible to have. For example, you might say in the interview, oh, I want to test entering a string as one of the arguments. That's a very typical UI test, entering a string where a number is expected, but from a unit test perspective, your tests are directly calling into these methods. So if you were to try to pass a string as an argument, your test wouldn't even compile. So that's not something you can have as a valid unit test. And it sends a signal to your interviewer that maybe you don't understand code. The next layer of the pyramid was services. So to test at the services layer, you need to understand web services. So I landed my last job because I knew how to do both web services and UI automation. And I was also asked web services questions in my recent interview spree. So this is definitely something that you want to brush up on. The question here is, given a user profile, how would you test CRUD operations of a REST API? So CRUD is an acronym for 4 basic functions on a data repository. It stands for create, read, update, and delete. These concepts can translate to the common operations for REST APIs. So create correlates to post, read correlates to get, update correlates to put, and delete is delete. Now, the original interview question was, given a user profile, how would you test CRUD operations of a REST API? Let's look at the REST API methods and list some tests. Notice we weren't given the actual endpoint or any information about the parameters. Of course, that would help if you had that information. However, you don't want your interviewer to think that you can't think abstractly either. So you can form your question like, is there a spec available, or would you like me to solve this in general terms? So let's assume they just want you to solve it in general terms. Okay, so starting with the create profile scenarios, lean on what you do know, since you don't have the spec. Everyone on the call, I assume, has created a profile before on some site or another. So the types of fields may vary, but there's typically optional fields and required ones. So given that, you can come up with maybe like these 4 basic scenarios. Of course, if you knew more about the API, you can get more specific, but this illustrates that you understand the basics. You can also point out the expected results of the calls, which should include the status code, and that would be 201 for successful creations, and should include details of the body. So in this case, you don't know what that is, but you can state that you would also verify the body, and this is typically JSON, XML, or plain text. Here's a few tests for the get method. Notice I have error cases as well as happy path ones. I have cases where multiple calls will be made. Same rule applies about verifying the body and the response code. The successful response code for GET, however, is 200. So make sure you know the difference between those. And then you can learn more about these error codes and which is returned when. I have a link right there at the bottom of this slide and also in the resource section. For update, same kind of process. And then delete, also same kind of thing. So just think broadly and abstractly, be able to give them some tests, let them know how you would test this API, given what knowledge you do have, talk about the response codes in the body and things like that. All right, so UI automation. You may still get a few interviewers asking you something basic like write automation using the Selenium API to log into an app. I personally steer clear of this question because it's so overused and it's the one example everyone starts with when learning automation. I will say that in my latest interview spree, no one asked me anything that basic. Okay. Um, yeah. So yeah, no one's asked me anything like this. Lots of the interviewers have learned that that's just so simple, and they end up hiring this person who could do that basic interview, but nothing more complicated. So our automation interviews are getting tougher. I typically ask something more complex, like given this UI, and I'll show them a UI. This is a Twitter UI on iOS. So given this UI, how would you design your framework using the page object model pattern? In my opinion, this kind of question will expose if you understand this common design pattern and how to use it on something more complex than a login screen. So to answer this, first you begin by defining what elements you have that your test might need to interact with or verify. So looking at this, I see I have a banner header, profile, photo, name, handle, bio, location, link, number of people following, number of followers. There's an edit profile button, uh, tweet button. There's 4 tabs there, and um, each of those tabs has content and then a navigation footer. So next you determine how you might lay this out structurally. Mostly everything here is straightforward, and you can simply add these web elements to a profile page class. However, there's a few interesting things here that I want to see if the candidate picks up on. One is the edit profile button. That would only be on the profile page if the user is actually on their own page. So if the user is viewing someone else's page, that won't be there. I want to see if you think about those kinds of things. How do you design for this? Do you still include it in the profile page class, knowing that sometimes it's visible and sometimes it's not? Or do you make a base profile page class that has common elements and subclass it with my profile page or versus other people's profiles? So that's up to you to decide. Just be sure that you can justify your answer. Another interesting thing here is the tabs. So there's tweets, tweets and replies, media, and likes. So how would you handle that? That might be a question for you. Um, Actually, I wouldn't ask you that right off the bat. I'll see if that's something that you recognize yourself. And then if you didn't recognize it, it's kind of like a, -1 type of thing. And then I might give you like a little hint, like, oh, what would you do with these tabs? Okay. Um, What you do with those is up to you. With the content of all the tabs, will that go in the profile page class, or will you break out each tab into their own individual page object classes and provide methods from the profile page to click those tabs? Again, this is your decision, but be able to justify it. And then finally, what's interesting here is the navigation bar at the bottom, the footer. So this appears on every page. You might not know that without asking clarifying questions. But given that, how would you handle it? Would you add code for this in every page object class you create? Or would you make a base page um, that all page object classes inherited from and put the navigation in there? Or would you do something totally different? Again, your decision, just be able to justify it and why you're doing it, what's the pros and cons of the approach you choose. I'll tell you what I would do personally. This is not gospel, but I think it's a pretty good strategy. So I personally would design a base page class, and it would have the footer, navigation, web elements, and any corresponding methods, as well as anything else that was common to every page of the app. So this abstraction would allow for reuse and avoid code duplication. So that would be my justification. I would create separate classes for each of those tabs and provide handles to them from click methods that would live in my profile page class. So my justification is because I like my page object classes to be as small as possible so that they're maintainable. The tabs are components of the page.
Angie, I'm sorry to jump in, but I think that your presentation is not being updated. What we see currently on the screen is just your Twitter profile page.
Yeah, I'm still right there.
You're still right there? Okay,
Yep.
because we got some questions on it. Okay, perfect. Sorry for jumping in.
No problem.
Okay.
Okay. Um, right. So those tabs, um, these are components, and each of them have a bunch more web elements and corresponding methods within them, right? So having all of that within this one class will not make that will not only make like a very big class, but it'll also be confusing to use. Like with all of the methods in a class, how will the calling test know which ones are associated with which stage of this page, right? And then the last thing was the edit button. So I would study the differences between my profile page and that of another user. So is this the only difference? And that might be a question that you ask to the interviewer. After asking some questions, maybe they'll show you another picture or give you some more information. But upon that research, you can see that this is the only functionality that is available on my profile that's not available when I view someone else's profile. However, the vice versa is not true. So there's loads of functionality available on another user's profile page that is not available on my profile page, such as follow, unfollow, block, mute, etc. So that gives me a good case for making a base profile page that contains the web elements and functionality that is common on any profile. And then also making two more classes to represent my profile page versus someone else's profile page. And I would add what's specific to those pages within those classes. Okay. I guess you guys are tired of looking at me, so let's move to the next slide. Um, Another thing I like to make sure is that the people who I'm interviewing are comfortable with the DOM. And it's such a big part of doing automation, and yet so many people rely on Firebug. And to be honest, this is why your tests are flaky. Let's say I ask, given this UI, I want to write a method that can select one of the options and then clicks vote. It should be generic enough such that any test can call this method and specify which poll choice they want to vote on. Okay, so I would give the candidate this UI visual, and then I would give them the HTML that goes behind that poll. So once I hit people with this HTML, they freak out, right? As if they've never seen HTML before, but you're an automation engineer. And so a very common response I get is, oh, I just use Firebug to get the handle. Well, the problem with that is that there aren't any specific identifiers on the element. Then what Firebug gives you is going to be extremely fragile. Okay, so this is what Firebug gave me for the second poll option. That's, trash pretty much. Um, how do I even know the text that corresponds to this poll option? You'd have to make your method force the test to send in the position of the option they want to choose. You see that 2 on the end, um, as opposed to the text of it, which is that more resembles the user intent. If something is added or removed within this hierarchy, then this is no longer valid and the test breaks. So I have a link to a blog post I wrote that talks more about this, and that is at the bottom of the screen and also in the resources. Okay, so let's go back to this DOM and figure out how to get the elements. So we can see the text here. There's a span element that's highlighted line 7, line 15. However, that element has no identifiers on it at all. So I agree that this is not ideal, and it would really be great if there were identifiers. However, this is real life, right? How are you going to handle it? So we can search for any span element in the DOM that has this text maybe, but that seems risky as well to me. So if a candidate gave me that response, I would challenge them on that, right? So is it likely that there could be any other span on this page with the text yes or no? Of course there can be, right? That's a really common word. And remember, your task is to write a method to be able to handle any poll selection. So you can't bank on having unique words, right? So what you can do is to look up one level at the parent element. It has a class that's specific to radio buttons, okay? So given that, along with the text, you can construct a CSS selector, or XPath, that uses that relationship. And that would be the XPath down there at the bottom. Okay. All right. So that covers the automation round. Let's get into the development round. All right. So this is the scariest round for people, me included. In this round, you'll be asked coding questions that aren't specific to automation at all. They're basically the same questions that would be given to a developer candidate. And the number of questions you have to answer can vary from 1 to up to like 5. So some of the companies I interviewed with had like 5 rounds of these coding challenges. Let me go on record saying that I do not advocate for these types of questions for automation engineers. I think it's horrible, to be honest, and I'm not encouraging this. But with so many automation projects failing, managers are insisting on having strong coders as automation engineers. Okay, I don't necessarily think being a strong coder automatically makes you a strong automation engineer, but whatever, I digress. I'm going to go over these questions because I don't want you all to be caught off guard, not because I think that they are fair. Okay. So here are the key things that you'll need to brush up on. Big O notation, data structures, and algorithms. So for just about any technical problem that you get, you'll need to choose the algorithm, choose the best data structure to use, and then be able to calculate the big O complexity of your solution. So let's talk a little bit about big O notation. So This is huge in these coding interviews. What it is a measurement of the performance of an algorithm, like in terms of execution time or space utilized. I can understand stressing this for developers who are working on large scale projects with millions of records. But unfortunately, since you're getting the same questions that they do, you have to know this as well. So I'm going to be perfectly honest with you all. I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in computer science. So I learned this stuff in college. However, I've never used it in my career at all, except during this last interview spree that I went on. So I can't give you like all the in and outs of this. There's great links in the resources section of this slide deck. And then I can share with you this here, which is the basic study card that I made for myself when preparing for my interviews. Okay, so I have, these are the most common in the first column. These are the most common big O notations, right? So O of 1 is considered excellence. This is usually if you're doing something like inserting, deleting, searching, and something like maybe a hash table. Um, the performance is the same regardless of the input set, right? And then there's O of log n, which is good. This is typically, like, think of an example of this is a binary search. This is where it's high performance at the beginning, but then it flattens as the size of the data set increases. O of n is fair. This means the performance will deteriorate in direct proportion to the input set. O of n of log n is bad. So this is O of n combined with the O of log of n, right? A common example for this is sorting. And then there's O of n squared. This is horrible. This is when you're doing nested loops. That could get up to however many nested loops you had. So if you had 3 nested loops, that would be O of n cubed. And then finally, O of 2 to the nth. Okay, and think of that as something like recursive functions with multiple calls. All right, so maybe you guys know this stuff. If you do, great. If not, if before you go on your next tech interview, definitely brush up on that. All right, the data structure. So here are the common data structures that you need to know about. So given a problem, you'd probably use one of these. The hash table is by far the most commonly used for the tech questions. So just about every tech question I had involved the use of a hash table. And that's because it has a low uh, complexity word count calculation. So keep that one at the top of your head when you're trying to figure out how you're going to solve a problem. Okay. As far as the stack and the queue stuff, I didn't get anything with linked lists, but stack and queue, I was asked to like implement a stack from scratch, implement a queue from scratch, and like have them work together and that kind of thing. So brush up on that as well. All right, let's look at some problems. Okay, D, my screen is black on purpose. All right, so different companies have like different styles in conducting their tech interviews. So some will use a coding site such as HackerRank, which provides a browser-based IDE that you both can see. And then some will use word editors such as Google Docs. Those are horrible, but whatever. Okay, so you will have to write on, some of them will have you write on the whiteboard. It just all really depends on the company and maybe who's interviewing you. So be sure you ask about this before the interview. When you're talking with maybe a recruiter or the hiring manager, ask about that so that you're not caught off guard. And then typically the questions will be given to you by like 1 or 2 interviewers. In my case, everyone was a developer. Um, well, that's not true. I had some automation engineers interview me as well. And yep, they are staring at you while you do it. So that can be nerve-wracking, but I'll give you some tips on how to make this go smoothly. Okay, so with all of the problems I was given, nothing was ever given to me written. It was all verbal instruction. So it's very important to listen, write down what you think they're asking, write it down so that they can see, and then clarify it with them. So let's say the interviewer asks, given two arrays of characters, print out any character that appears in both arrays. Okay, so go ahead and write out what you think you heard. Okay, yep, two arrays, and I'm going to print any that appear in both. Any, probably should have said character there, but yeah, print any that appear in both. Not only is it best to clarify, but I promise you that at some point you're going to become frazzled and you're going to forget what you're doing. And it's going to be very helpful to have those instructions right there to keep you on task. Okay, so the next thing you want to do is come up with a single example and go ahead and write that out too. Right? So the interviewers may provide this example for you, but if they don't, make one up yourself. This will give you something visual to code to. So this is a really simple example. I personally like to make mine a bit more challenging to force me to code for it. Not that I'm trying to be like tough or like look better, but if you code for the simplest example, then you might miss like the tricky example. So I try to put my example as the tricky one up front to force me to think it through. Okay, so maybe making the two arrays be of a different length, or maybe add a duplicate element to the array. Okay, so there's that example. Here I added another C to the first array. Yeah, and before you write any code, go ahead and also write out what the expected result is as well. Again, this is clarifying. So the worst thing in the world would be to finish coding something and then realize you misunderstood what was asked of you. So you'll be rattled and it'll be hard for you to recover. So go ahead and just put this info out there up front. So I would say, okay, given these two arrays, if I were to print any that appeared in both, then this would be my output. And then ask them, does that look right? Yep. Then you can go ahead and get coding. This will also help you kind of calm your nerves and get ready to really think it through. Okay. Now we're ready to code this. Coming up with an approach, which data structure to use, and the big old complexity work. This will take time to think through all of that. You don't want to take forever to respond, because then you'll think that they're thinking that you don't know how to even begin, and that will rattle you even more. So instead, go ahead and do whatever solution comes to mind first. I recommend prefacing it with just that, like say, okay, let me just get my thoughts out here and I can refine it if needed. Okay. Everyone I did that with was perfectly fine with that. So to solve this problem, the first thing you probably think to do is a nested loop where you traverse through A and check for B, right? So let's see how that works out for us. So here we have a nested loop to find the intersection, but there are a couple of things wrong with this solution. But that's okay, because you already told them that this was just a brain dump, right? So you want to make sure you call out your mistakes before your interviewer does. Okay, and it's kind of hard to do that, because most of the interviewers interviews, you won't have an editor where you can actually execute the code. So you have to really be able to mentally execute this and learn from the results. That's where the example comes in handy as well. So you can start walking through your code with the example that you have there. Okay, so the first thing that's wrong here is that this will print C, B, and then C again. And we don't want that C printed twice because that implies that there's two C's in both arrays. So this is exactly why it was so important to have a good example from the jump. So I might have missed this otherwise. The other thing that's bad here is the nested loops. So for your final solution, try to avoid nested loops like the plague. Okay, this particular solution is O of n squared, which according to our little cheat sheet is horrible. So what you want to do here is say to your interviewer, okay, I'd like to improve on this. This will take O of n squared work, and it won't work in a case where I have duplicates in one array that don't appear in the other. All right, that statement right there, that's gold. It shows your interviewer that you can understand big O complexity. It shows that you can look at your solution and you can think of cases to break it. And it shows that you are not afraid to admit when you've messed up. Okay, so unless you took forever to come up with this and you're out of time, then the interviewer will more than likely let you proceed with an improved solution. Okay, they'll even let you know if the time complexity is not a factor. So not every interviewer cares about that. You might luck out and get someone who is not being mean. But let's assume that you aren't so lucky. How can we improve this? You might want to sort to be more efficient. That's the first thing that would come to my mind. But remember, sorting has a bad big O complexity score. So avoid that if you can too, right? So think through your data structures now. And this is where our good friend hash table comes into play. So knowing that hash tables store unique keys, we can transfer everything from array A into there. So that's O of 1 work. Then we can loop through array B and print if it's in the hash map we're going to make, right? So the loops are O of n work. So this is what this looks like. This will work, and this has much better complexity than the original solution. So it doesn't look as simplistic as the first algorithm, and to the untrained eye, you think that this was an inferior solution, but I promise you it's not. So we went from O of n squared to O of n, which is better time. And now we're also making sure that we are printing the appropriate duplicates, okay? So what we did here, notice we made one standalone loop to insert all of the A's, array A's contents into the map. And we use the value field to store how many times that character appears in array A. Next, we have another standalone loop to iterate through array B to determine what's common. Remember our failed assumption from the last round. So this time we have to pay attention to the counts. If we find a character from array B inside of array A, then we can go ahead and print it and decrement the occurrences. If it's the last occurrence in the map, then we remove it from the map. Okay, so I know this is a lot to keep in mind, but interviewers are usually pretty good about providing hints if they see that you're struggling or going down the wrong path. So just be sure to not get so caught up in your thoughts that you're not listening to the clues that they're giving you. All right. So that's one problem. We're going to look at one more. The interviewer asks you to find how many times a specific string appears in a list of strings. So we go ahead, we write down the instructions that we heard, and we write down our example and expected result. Okay. And this is our code. So here we have a method that takes the string and takes the list, initializes a counter to 0, and then we just have this one for loop. So that seems okay. And then we compare each element in the list to that string, and if it's equal, then we increase the counter by 1, and then at the end we simply print out the counter. Okay, so this answer is okay, but it's not going to help you stand out in the crowd, right? So you're not the only person they're interviewing, and people who come up with maybe something more creative usually stand out, right? So in looking at this, for starters, there's 2 opportunities here for null pointer exceptions on line 4. If the list itself is null, that's a null pointer exception, or if one of the list entries is null. So you could tweak this to check for all of that, okay? But what would be even more impressive is if you showed your knowledge for your language's libraries. For example, there's a method in Java that will already do this very thing. So there's no need for you to reinvent the wheel, right? So you could provide a solution like this one. In this one, we use the collections.frequency method. This is a built-in library, and this shows our awareness of the language that we're using, that we put on our resume and claim to be an expert in. It also eliminates the need to check for the null pointer exception in the list entries, right? So we add in the check for that other null pointer on the list itself, and voila, this is what we have. With this solution, it also demonstrates your ability to think about things that could fail. So that's a really good attribute for a test automation engineer. Okay. Now studying. It's going to sound like I'm a hypocrite because I recently published an article denouncing the notion of having to study for interviews just because the questions are outside of what your job responsibilities will be. I'm not a hypocrite. I do stand by that. But if you want to study, here are some good ways to do so. All right. So cracking the code interview. This is a book by Gail McDowell. This book is extraordinary. It covers a lot of what I talked about today, but in great detail. It has lots and lots of examples of problems, and it even has, it's mostly focused on development interviews, but it has a chapter on for tests as well. So it goes over like how you might go about testing something or how you answer the questions, and then the development stuff as well. Big O notation, data structures, algorithms, all that good stuff is in there. And then another site that you can practice on is HackerRank. So HackerRank has a lot of like kind of sample, well, not really. They have interview type questions. They have questions where you can practice on these sort of things. So you can practice different algorithms. You can practice with different data structures. So that's good for you. What they don't have is like an ability to really judge it, right? So they'll basically make sure that your solution works with whatever tests that were provided with it. But we saw in the last example we had, like our code would have worked, but that might have not been the most optimal solution, or it might have not been the best solution. So you kind of lose that, and you'll need to track that yourself. Okay. And then here's the resources. They will be available. I'll make these slides available right after the talk, and so you can download this stuff there. All right. And good luck to you all. Any questions? Adi will let me know.
Yeah, oh my God. We have a lot of them actually. Yeah. Yeah, but we'll just take them one at a time until we run out of time. Okay, so this is a question that actually a lot of people asked. Concerning the coding examples, would you expect the candidate to physically code in front of you to test their ability? I'm thinking of the duration of the interview. It could take some time.
Yes, they expect you to code in front of them. So it's, I'm gonna tell you, it is enormous pressure on you. You're there, you have a whiteboard or maybe your laptop, and it's one or two people that are just basically standing there watching your every keystroke. Um, the longer you take on it is, of course, not that good, right? So, like in the one where I had the 5 round interview, they typically ask me like one question per, and those interviews were like 45 minutes. So one question, and I would have to code it in 45 minutes, right? Um, that's why I said, like, if your first solution, you take the entire 45 minutes to come up with your first answer, then that's not really good because you didn't leave yourself any time to refine it. So that's where the hacker rank stuff comes in handy too. Like, so you can start practicing just like coding on the spot, maybe like timing yourself or something like that. Um, and when you do that, you'll become more comfortable with it. So when they give you a solution, um, hopefully you won't take too long to get to it. I got to a point where I was interviewing, I could get through like 3 iterations of refining the solution within that 45 minutes. So, that was pretty impressive to them. So if you can try to get through them, like I said, you want to just kind of throw your first idea out there. Just do that. It doesn't have to be perfect, and then you can let them know that you're refining it. One thing I forgot to say is to make sure you talk out loud when you're doing these things as well. So give them your thoughts, and that's kind of difficult to do because you're thinking so intensely about solving the problem. But let them know your thoughts, like, I'm thinking about doing a loop that's going to do this. I'm making this decision because. And so when you do things like that, they'll try to help you out to say, okay, no, I don't think you should do that. What if you did this instead, and try to get you back on the right track so that you don't use all of your time on trying to solve that problem.
Next question.
hmm
Okay. In many interviews, people ask me how much automation coverage do I have? For me, it's a very tough question because I can't define coverage in numbers. How would you address this question?
I would explain it just like that, like saying that you can't really define that in numbers or whatever. Try to see like what it is they're really asking. You'll be surprised, like a lot of people, you'll ask them a question based on your worldview. I'm talking from the interviewer's perspective, and when they answer it, it's so profound that it lets you know that maybe you're thinking about something wrong. So where a lot of candidates kind of miss the mark is that they're trying to appease the interviewer and just tell them whatever it is they want to hear. Be yourself. If there's a reason why you don't have that answer in the terms that they wanted in, explain why not. You might enlighten them, and they'll realize like, wow, this person really thinks about this deeply and is someone who understands automation and can take us to the next level. So, that might give you the advantage.
Okay, so the next question is actually two questions. And here goes. For some reason, I've seen the following two questions come up over and over during interviews. What's the best way to answer them? So the first one, and once you've answered that one, I'll ask you the second one.
All
So
right.
the first one is, we know you've used automation frameworks, but have you ever created your own framework from scratch?
Yeah. So, yeah, people ask this a lot, and what they want to see is basically your level. So, are you a junior? Are you just starting out? Are you someone who is able to contribute to the framework, right? So, they may already have someone on a team who's able to just contribute tests. They don't really, they might have just gotten into it or something like that, but they don't really know how to build and design the page objects. They don't really know how to get the handles to the elements so that they're not flaky, right? So they want someone, what they're trying to see is if you are someone who understands how to build this. It's funny because the question is weird, especially when people already have a framework in place. I wonder, like, why are you asking them if they know how to build it from scratch when you have one? You don't need someone to build it from scratch. But what I think they're really trying to get at is, do you understand the complexities of the framework and how to design and how to maintain it and keep it from getting out of hand? So to answer that, I would just basically tell anything that you've done framework wise, like, well, I haven't built it from zero, but I have substantial experience in um, enhancing our framework by doing X, Y, Z. I understand, the design patterns. Talk about any design patterns that you've used in your automation. Just answer their question to show them that you are a senior if you are.
Okay, and the second part of that question, and I actually saw that topic come up in a lot of other questions here. So that would be, we know you know what CI, continuous integration, is, but have you ever set up a CI system from scratch? How would you answer that in an interview?
Um, Honestly, yeah, just answer honestly. Have you set it up from scratch? If you haven't, like, don't try to BS people. Let them know, no, that's not my niche or whatever. Like, um, me personally, I don't set up CI systems. Like, I know how to, I don't like to do them. I can work with them. I know how to maintain and manage them. So that would be my answer. If someone asked me, I would say, no, I don't build them from scratch. I get someone else to do it or whatever. But I do understand it. I'll talk about what it is and talk about what role I have played in it.
Next question. I know we're running a bit over time, but since Angie is a super busy woman, we're going to keep her for as long as we've got her, just to answer just a couple more questions. We're going to take advantage of you, Angie, today. Next question. What happens if you get a call for automation post, but in a different set of tool languages and frameworks? Should I consider taking the job offer or coming into an interview?
Yeah, you should, especially if you understand the foundations of test automation. If you understand that, then you can work with any of the tools. So the tools, they're tools, right? They don't do the magic. It's you and your understanding of how to structure things that's important. So this new job that I took at Twitter, I needed to build um, a new automation framework for iOS from scratch. And I don't know, I needed to use one of the languages for Apple, so Objective-C or Swift. I don't know either one of them. I need to use the Xcode IDE. I've never worked in Xcode. So these were new opportunities for me. I still took the job because I understand the principles, the foundational principles of automation. And so I was able to get that framework up in less than a week because the tools didn't matter, right? And so that was a win-win for me, where I am learning something new but still able to, it's not, unobtainable. I still was able to do it because I understood the basics, but I was still able to pick up like a new language and a new IDE, and so that was cool. So yeah, go ahead and take the interview.
Okay. An interesting questions. If I have tons of experience in manual testing, but only basic coding experience, what would be the best type of automation positions to pursue?
There's some hybrid positions where managers are looking for testers with an interest in automation. So maybe that might be something you can go after, where you're still able to do what you're comfortable with, but they might have a mentor or someone there who is able to assist you and help you to ramp up. So that would be perfect, because you're not at home trying to learn all of this stuff on your own, which I realize can be a very daunting task. You're actually with someone who does know how to do this, and so you can learn a lot quicker that way. So I would look for something like that, something where there's already automation people there, senior ones, not one where you're going to be the only automation person.
We are seriously out of time, so we are going to take one last question. Here it is. Have you encountered any questions as a job seeker in automation which made you inclined to take a second look, either because they made you feel more positively or more negatively about a potential employer or a team?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yes, I have, in both cases, positive and negative. So when you're interviewing with someone, and you can tell by the questions that they ask that they are also a student of the craft of test automation, then that's a green light. Like, that's a signal to me that this is somewhere I want to be. On the other hand, I've also been in interviews where they may have been very focused on a specific tool or a specific methodology, been very focused on metrics and things that I don't think are very valuable to automation. And so in cases like those, I knew that it wasn't the right fit. Now, there's some times where people have their certain worldview, and they may ask you questions regarding that. But if they acknowledge the wealth of information and experience that you bring, and are willing to hear you out and listen to your ideas, and maybe together you all can bring the organization forward in test automation, that's a different story. I wouldn't be opposed to that. But where people are very set in their ways, and you know for a fact like this isn't really the right path, I would avoid situations like that. It's just bound to be a failure.
Okay, so unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today. I just wanted to mention that I saw all the compliments you posted for Angie in the questions panel. She obviously couldn't look at them while presenting, but rest assured that I will forward all of them to her once we wrap up this session. I want to thank Angie, of course, for taking the time to put together this super detailed and hands-on session and taking the time to walk us through the job interview Q&A process. And again, I want to thank everyone that took the time and joined us for this live session. I hope to see you at our next event.
Thank you all so much for attending. If you have any further questions you think of after this, then you can contact me on my blog, angiejones.tech. I also have a lot of good resources there that you can check out, as well as on Twitter. I'm TechGirl1908, so you can follow me or reach out to me there as well. And the slides are available at slides.com/Angie Jones. Thanks so much, everyone.